So good afternoon. My name is Scott Lancaster, and I am a research and instruction librarian here at Waters Library at A&M Commerce. And I'm going to go over some things that you can do if you're in like the final stage in your dissertation or thesis. So I'm going to assume you know basics of how to do research and that you have done at least the preliminary part of your research, and you are either into the part of finishing your dissertation or thesis, or even getting it ready, the final stages of graduating. And I will be going over some things in a PowerPoint, and then I'm going to go to the website. And I've pulled out some questions that we've had over the years that I think people need to know at the end, because that maybe it's they're having to go through and update something, or they weren't aware that something was available, or that something needed to be done until they're right at the end point of trying to graduate. And so the sooner you know these things, the better. But first, we'll look at the screen, and you may be familiar with some of these things. Can you say the final dissertation or thesis preparation? Okay. First, I always sort of try to let people know this, that your dissertation or thesis is going to be seen, certainly very likely to be seen by more than just your committee. In 2017, I did a study that showed that approximately 15% of A&M Commerce, as well as ETSU thesis and dissertations that were in the ProQuest database, had been cited by other documents that were in the ProQuest database. So that's just people out there, other researchers that are reading your thesis or dissertation. So it really, you need to make it the best that you can, not just for yourself, but because it is representing you in the broader world. And in fact, these are the top 3 that I found that were cited. And I've even found, since I put this together last year, they've been cited even more than they had been. Our top cited one is a dissertation written in 2004 by somebody that I think just went back to East Texas, and he was a school superintendent. He never went on to do anything else in publishing or writing, but he happened to write a dissertation that everybody was really interested in. And at last count, in the ProQuest, it was cited 76 times. In Google Scholar, I found it was cited 138 times. So I want to look at some of the things that maybe when you've taken your document to your committee, that maybe they're going to say it needs to be, you need to find different sources for these items. And these are actually citations from dissertations that were done in 2013, that in my opinion, they should have come to the library and got better sources. They're using ideafinder.com, fatherhoodabout.com, and Wikipedia especially was pretty egregious, and freepatentonline.com. And actually with that, the Wikipedia, the Beck's anxiety inventory, I mean, you would find innumerable reference items in the library that would give you information about that, and you might use Wikipedia to point you to one of those sources, but I certainly would not put that as a final thing in my dissertation. And then the last one that is from this Free Patents Online, the Wallace article, actually that's an ERIC document. And for some reason, it was reproduced in this freepatentsonline.com, and maybe that's where the person found it. but it's not the thing that you should put in your reference list for your thesis or dissertation. You should go to the original source, which is going to be eric.gov, and put that in. Or if it could have appeared as a journal article, but don't use these secondary places that have republished it, especially when in all likelihood they're violating copyright by publishing it in that situation. Also, it may not happen in any of what y'all are doing, but be aware that sometimes articles are retracted, and it's not necessarily because the information was found to be inaccurate, but in the case of this article that was retracted, it was found that some of the writers had inappropriate affiliations that called into question their objectivity about the topic that they were dealing with. So certainly for any really important articles that you've used, and if they're about some volatile topic, which in this case, autism and is fairly volatile, or a lot of differing opinions about it and about how it relates to vaccines and stuff. But make sure that the article is still, considered to be in good publication, or just be aware that that happens from time to time. And I think this is the last to come from the 2013 study that I did. Use appropriate sources, and these could be good sources in some situations, but be sure that you're using them properly. In the first case, the Garrison article, Divorced Dads Need to Be Society's New Role Models, just understand that dadsdivorce.com is published by a law firm in the DFW area called Cordell and Cordell that specifically advocates for men's rights in divorce. And so be aware that that's their point of view. That's what they're promoting. So you will find that articles, publications have got even a prejudice, if you would call it that, which is not necessarily bad. They've got a point of view. They've got something they're promoting, but make sure you understand that and that it works well with what you're saying, and that you identify that if need be in presenting them or their work as a source. And the second one, I don't know, for some reason, this person who wrote a dissertation that was about a US topic, it was about women, middle-aged women who go back to college. And the writer used this talkitover.in website to get a definition of gender stereotypes. That's an Indian website. It's a counseling firm. And I mean, not only is it kind of not appropriate to just be getting your definition off some random website, but it's not even, could be not even culturally appropriate, because I think the dissertation was dealing with women in Appalachia, and women in India and women in rural America have far different stereotypes that are sort of impacting them. So if you don't know where else to go, come to the library. I could have pointed this person to any number of better resources to get a definition of gender stereotypes. You may also find that you're asked to put your document through Authenticate, or you won't put it through, your advisor will, or someone else will. I put documents through Authenticate. There are several others on campus that are tasked with doing that. And you get what's called an originality score. And that's at the point where I see a lot of people who have issues that need to be cleaned up. The graduate school is interested in an overall originality score that shows how much of the dissertation or thesis is your own writing as opposed to other people's writing. They're going to assume that everything that somebody else is writing is properly cited. You know, it's either going to be in quotation marks or it's going to be set off. It's going to say where it came from, but they just want to have a certain percentage of originality in your thesis or dissertation. You can say this one at 47% is way over the top because I think it's something in the teens that they expect, and it fluctuates, I think, from program to program. It can be, it's something you work out with your advisor. But what we can do in the library is help you understand the difference or how it impacts plagiarism, because we teach and about how to avoid plagiarism and how to properly cite the things and make sure that it's indicated that it's not your writing, and understand the difference between copyright and plagiarism. Copyright is a legal issue. It's where you may say that this is somebody else's writing, but there's only a certain amount of it that you can actually use according to the law. On the other hand, plagiarism is an academic, or it's an ethical issue where you use writing that's not your own, but you say specifically where it came from. And it doesn't always have to be copyright infringement. If something's in the public domain, I mean, if it's something hundreds of years old, you're not going to be violating copyright, but in the standards of academic writing, you will be plagiarizing if you don't say where it came from. And in the originality report that is produced in Authenticate, we can help you see areas where you probably need to clean it up. For instance, in this one, where it highlights things that are not original. And you can see these are cited with Kibler and Wilson, but there's these huge chunks that are not this person's original, not the student's original work. That would have to be put in quotation marks or some other way. It's not a paraphrase. The person has written this as if it were a paraphrase, and it's not. This is just sort of a really specific issue that you can see. The online report in Authenticate is dynamic in that I can hover the mouse over the highlighted portion and it will show me the original. So I can see exactly what that is. And this is where I can see this thing has been improperly plagiarized. There's too many sections that should be in quotation marks. The report you get is a PDF and won't be quite as dynamic. So you'll have to, if you have a specific question about wanting to go back to the original to get this little pop-up box, you're going to have to work with your advisor or whoever has the access to Authenticate for you. I also, and again here, you know, missing quotation marks, even though it's cited, that whole big chunk needs to be in quotation marks. And this isn't even cited. So you can see this is just, you know, downright plagiarism where they copied and pasted something and haven't even given any indication where it's from. So that's kind of the end of what I wanted to show you from the PowerPoint. Now I wanted to go with the time that was left to the library website. And what I want to go over are some things that can be useful after you've got your document and you might be asked to get more information. We're going to look specifically at one search, journal search, browsing, the A&M system, dissertations and theses database, using Crossref, which actually is not, it's not something we pay for, it's freely available, but it's when you're looking for a DOI, and then that will kind of cross over to looking at LibKey. If you don't know about that, that's a really good resource. And then finally, journal citation report and Ulrichs. So I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can switch to the library website. Okay, this is the library website. And I like I said, I pulled out some specific questions that I've gotten over the years. And we're going to look at the resources that can help to answer these. The first question is, I need this article, Border Zones in Adolescents, Literacy Practices, Connecting Out-of-School Literacies to the Reading Curriculum. And that's in a journal called Urban Education. Oftentimes, you get to the end and you turn in your dissertation and you found that you have cited, or you've given a quote from something, but you don't know exactly where it came from, or you don't have the full citation. Maybe you just have, you might have the title, but you didn't put in any more of the citation, like where it came from. And so there's a number of places that you can go looking for these, but we're going to just start with one search, which is this white box here. You probably know it's the federated search that will search in almost all of our resources. So I'm going to paste in the name of this article and click search. I don't always find it. So here it is, Border Zones in Adolescent Literacy Practices. So that's very easy to find, just to look for it in one search to get an article. And if I just knew well, usually a lot of times what happens is people don't know the page numbers, or maybe they've got a quote and they don't know what page it was on. So they've got to go back and figure that out. So that's how you can find the article, and you would click on available online and it would take you to the article. Another question that I had was, I cannot locate information on Marian Wright Edelman as to her theory on education. I've found articles written about her as book reviews only. That often happens for me when I'm doing researches. I find there's all these book reviews that come up, and while they might be interesting and I might get something out of it, I don't really need that for I'm looking for something else. So we'll search with Marian Wright Edelman. So we don't want book reviews, and any of the ProQuest databases, as well as OneSearch, which uses a ProQuest interface, will allow you to not only include, but also exclude things. So I've just searched on this person's name, which is also going to possibly include articles or items with this person as an author. But I'm going to first say, I just want peer-reviewed journal articles But now I'm going to come down here under resource type. And you'll see in this case, there's only 9 of them that are reviews and 268 are articles. So it wouldn't be too onerous to actually just look through and weed out those. But if there's like a lot of book reviews, it's best to just take them out. Notice when I hover over it, I get a box on the left and then a red box on the right. It's the right where you do exclude. So I checked that, and now that's taken the book reviews out. And even keep in mind that book reviews will appear in peer-reviewed journals. So limiting your results to peer-reviewed journals is not necessarily going to take out book reviews. And book reviews are not peer-reviewed articles, they're book reviews, but not everything in a peer-reviewed journal is actually a peer-reviewed article. It will have editorials as well as book reviews and other items. So that is using OneSearch to find articles and exclude book reviews. In another case, I had the question looking for an article, Caregiving and the Stress Process, and they couldn't find it. They said, how do I find it? So I went, like I usually do, to OneSearch, and I put in the title of the article, and I clicked search, and I didn't get anything. The next thing I might do is put this in quotation marks, which if you're not familiar with that, it's going to look for that exact phrase. And again, it did not find it. So what I'm going to do is go to Google. And a lot of times, people will, authors will have their resumes, or someone else will list the article in even a blog or something. And I'm not looking for the article. I'm just trying to find out what the citation is, or just get more information about it. So again, here I'm going to put in the name of the article. If I didn't find it, I would put it in quotation marks. And actually, they did have the last name of the writer, which they said was Perlin. So again, you'll see here, I found a number of places where I might find it, at least find the citation. And so I found that it is in a journal called Gerontologist, and it was published in 1990. But this isn't giving me the full text. So I keep in mind this Gerontologist, 1990, and I'm going to go back to the library homepage. And I'm actually going to go to journal search. Well, so I have to be in OneSearch to find that. So I'm going to journal search, and I'm going to put in gerontologist. And I've discovered, because I looked this up before, that at some point this journal changed its name to Clinical Gerontologist. So keep in mind that journals sometimes change titles, and OneSearch is set up to recognize that. And so I'm going to go open the record for gerontologist. And remember, it was 1990 was when the article was published. If we look back here, 1990. Well, come to find out, we have it in 3 databases, but none of these go back to 1990. So in this case, I'm actually going to have to get it through interlibrary loan, but at least I know the actual citation now. So when I turn in the name of the article, I can also include the citation. Jake in ILL will discover this for you if you don't know it, but it's always faster if you know it to put it in there. So that's how I use Google sometimes to clean up a citation that I might not know about. In another case where I did not find an article in OneSearch that someone asked about, they wanted something called the PhD octopus. And this is an article that was actually published in 1903. And all I know is that the last name of the writer is James. So I'm always eager to look up something that is that old in Google because it's in the public domain. So it's possible I'm going to find the full text of the article because there's no copyright issue with putting it on there. And actually, I found here somebody at University of Kentucky has reproduced it online, which will give me the text. But even then, this is not you really should track down the original if you're going to use it as a citation. So I don't know if you can read this, but it says that it was originally published in Harvard Monthly, March 1903. So I would try to get my hands on the original if I was going to, just to make sure for myself that, because I don't want to cite something that I don't even know who put this in University of Kentucky. I don't know for sure that they've reproduced it properly. So, but I know where it came from. So that was using the journal search to, so remember that in OneSearch, you have journal search here where you can put in the name of a journal, but we also have a tool called Browsing, which actually you get to by clicking on journals here. And this is really useful for current things, things that are really current. It wouldn't have been, certainly that 1903 thing would not have shown up in here. Someone asks, they're wanting to get a certain article from a publication called ELT Journal. So you put in the name of the journal, a number of things will pop up, sometimes more than one. I see it's this first one is what I want. So I click here. And the article they want is from 1991. Well, the browsing record just goes back to 2005. So I have to click on See All, and it's going to open it up in OneSearch. This is my catalog record. And if I click on that, I can come down and again, I say it's going to be indexed here, but it's not actually going to be full text. So in this case, I'll also have to get it through interlibrary loan. But to put in browsing, another thing, someone had asked, how do I find academic journals on a certain subject? And they didn't even give the subject that they wanted, but you can do browse, instead of putting in the title of a journal, come down here to browse by journals. And let's say they wanted something on special education. I know that that is in, I think, social science. And well, I'm going to, I think it's going to be in psychology. So it would be, if you're looking, if you don't know exactly what journal you want, you just want to find other journals about a topic, go to the browse subject in browsing. If you're not aware, we have two dissertation databases. We have ProQuest Dissertation and we have ProQuest Dissertations and Theses full text, which is where you're going, it's going to be all of the institutions. And we have one that is just the A&M system. And keep in mind that this is not going to include East Texas State University theses and dissertations that were produced prior to the time we joined the A&M system. But if you're looking just for things from here, it's a lot better to start with this database, because then you're looking at a far smaller chunk of things, and it's a lot easier to maneuver through. But someone asked, where can I find dissertations that were A&M Commerce dissertations that were chaired by Arthur Borgamenke? So I'm going to go to advanced search in this A&M system one, and then I'm going to look up university institutions. This is where it's so easy, because if we were in the big one, there would just be thousands of things. But here we know, there's just 5 to have to choose from. So I'm going to add that to my search. And then I'm going to look up advisors. And this is going to include not just the chair, but I think it's going to pull in things where he might have been not the chair, but just on the committee. I'm going to put in the last name. Try to make sure I spell it properly. And you'll see there's actually more than one version of his name, because he for some reason, different people's dissertations, they chose to use different versions of his name. That's why I just put in the last name. So I'm going to assume these all refer to the same person. And I'm going to select them all and add to search. Now, I don't have to put anything up here in title or subject, because all I want are things with Dr. Borgamenke from A&M Commerce. And I should come up with about, because I've got 19 here to look at. And that's something, well, you'll probably often want to do, is to find things that are chaired by the person who is on, who's chairing your committee. And then the last thing I wanted to deal with was DOIs. First, someone asked, how do I find the DOI for articles that are located in databases that do not include DOIs? Well, first you have to understand that not every article is going to have a DOI, especially if it's an older article. And the style guides that you're using are just going to have to make, there will be some type of provision for what you do if you don't have a DOI. Just understand that not everything has one. But there is a tool called Crossref that can be useful. It's just crossref.org. And you will want to search in metadata if you are looking for the DOI for an article. And in this case, they were looking for an article called Facing the Student Loan Debt Crisis, Restoring the Integrity. And actually, I didn't find it. It's not here. So I just had to go back and tell that student there is no DOI for that. We looked it up in the databases just to be sure. But there is no DOI for that. And if you're not aware, because someone else had asked, and this is the last thing I was going to go over, how do I obtain a copy of an article with the DOI number? And then they gave a DOI number. Well, I can search in Crossref, because they didn't even have they didn't give me the title of the article. They just had the DOI. So if that's all you've got, well, I find it's this article, Left Back. However, you should be able to just put the DOI as a URL, because that's basically what it is, and find the article here. And what I wanted to show you, LibKey has come up here. LibKey is a resource that you can, it's a add-on to Chrome and other browsers, where it will recognize, if you're logged into it, it will recognize what A&M Commerce pays for access to. So A&M Commerce pays for access to American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, and LibKey has recognized that. So I can download the PDF through, because of LibKey. If I wasn't logged in, I probably wouldn't have been able to do that. And that same LibKey will work in things like Wikipedia. Anytime you see it pop up, then you'll know that there's something in that web page that LibKey is recognized. And with Wikipedia articles, if I go down all the way to the bottom, it's these things in the references that I'm going to have access to because of LibKey. And I think you would find out about, well, there's a research guide for LibKey that explains how you can get that to work on your browser. That was all that I had. Oh, I see there's 4 things in chat. Someone said, how do you cite that then? Sorry, I wasn't watching the chat, so I wasn't sure what that, were you talking about the DOI when you don't have the DOI? Oh, the one from 1902. I would, well, if you can't get it anywhere else, but that whoever that was that put it up on University of Kentucky, I mean, it's a little bit, it adds a little bit of credibility to it that it's somebody associated with the university that put it up there. So if I couldn't find it anywhere else, then yeah, I would cite it just as coming from that source. But I would include the original. I don't, MLA, which is what I'm most familiar with, has where when something's been reproduced somewhere, or like maybe it's in an anthology or something, you have, you include both things. So I would include the name of the thing, the name of that article, PhD Octopus by William James, and then give that URL, but then say, have the original thing that it was from Harvard, whatever that original thing was. But I would really try to find the original, and it's possible I could just find the original in Google Books because it's from 1903 and people are putting, libraries or other people are putting entire volumes of things into Google Books that are in the public domain. So I guess to sort of just reiterate, I would try to find the original and cite it in that way. But if I can't get my hands on the original, I would cite it as coming from that website. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, you can watch your you can watch for your email, and I will send out a link to the recording. And if you have any questions, please let me know. So have a nice day.